That summer, Emily met Charles by chance. He said, "My wish is to watch a fireworks display." She said, "I want an obvious preference." One day she mustered up the courage to write in his draft book, "I like you," but before he saw it, everything was too late. "You wished me peace and safety. What about you?" 5 days later, the evening party at number 1 middle school started on schedule, due to staff shortage. Emily was also sent to the backstage as free labor. Backstage, Emily ran into Charles, who had just finished his makeup. His hair was parted in a 3:7 ratio, and he had an angular and delicate face with upturned eyes that were very attractive. He raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw Emily, but he didn't say anything after all, since they were short of staff. When they were finally done and the show was about to start, Emily sneaked to sit on a stool beside the stage to slack off. The party was in the evening, and as soon as it started, Emily was so sleepy that she was about to fall asleep. Emily yawned and was about to fall asleep when a faint fragrance drifted into her nose. She looked up and met Charles's gaze. Emily wiped her tears and asked, "When can we go home? I'm so sleepy." Charles threw her a candy and said lightly, "It's about 9 o'clock. Emily picked up the candy and saw that this time it was not White Rabbit, but mint candy. She tore open the package and ate the candy. It was very cool and stimulated Emily's nerves, making her much more sober. Emily turned her head to look at Charles, then teased, "You look very handsome in a suit today, Charles." Charles raised his eyebrows and said with an upturned tone, "Really, Yaya?" It took her 2 seconds to realize that Charles was calling her by her nickname. Emily blushed slightly and said, "Why are you calling me by my nickname?" Charles tilted his head, looked at her for 2 seconds and suddenly smiled. "Shy. You're the one who's shy." Charles raised a smile, but before he could say anything he was called away to go on stage. Watching his back as he left, Emily covered her face with her hands, which felt a little hot. Emily didn't watch the show because she was a support staff and no one could restrain her, so she turned and left the auditorium and went to the canteen. After buying some snacks at the canteen, Emily sat down on the stool in front of the canteen and began to enjoy her food. Just as she was eating happily, cold voice suddenly came from above her head. "Is it tasty?" The sudden sound startled Emily, and the small bread in her hand fell to the ground with a pop. She turned her head stiffly and saw the familiar face. "Have you finished hosting?" Charles sat down next to her, leaning there lazily, as if he had no bones. Emily turned her head to look at him, and he was looking at her deeply. Charles said tiredly, "Yeah, just finished." He raised his hand and rubbed his temple, as if he was very tired. Emily pursed her lips, picked out a bag of QQ candy from the pile of snacks in her arms, tore open the package, took out one and put it into Charles's mouth. She smiled gently and said, "Eating sweet things will make you feel better." Charles doesn't like sweet things, but after hearing what she said, he silently chewed the QQ candy and swallowed it. The two sat together in silence. No one spoke, and the only sound was the chirping of cicadas in the trees. After a long silence, Emily suddenly spoke up. "You said that my health is so poor that I will not live past 18. Charles raised his hand and poked her head with his fingertips. "What do you think about every day?" Recalling something, Emily said, "By the way, it was your birthday yesterday, and you didn't make a wish yet." The sound of music and cicadas in the auditorium was in my ears. Charles whispered, "Then I wish you peace, happiness and good health." When the party was almost over, Emily and Charles returned to the auditorium together. He was going to give a thank you speech, so she found a seat in the last row of the auditorium. When Charles walked onto the stage, Emily finally got a clear look at his outfit. He is tall, looks handsome in a suit, and most importantly, he is also very handsome. When giving the closing remarks, the last words were reserved for Charles. Emily had read his manuscript, and the last words were, "I wish you all happiness every day." After a long time, Charles picked up the microphone and said his line. "Everyone is happy every day." After a pause, he added, "Yaya is happy too." Emily, who was hiding in the last row, felt her brows twitch suddenly and her heart was beating wildly. No one knew who Yaya was, and given the heated atmosphere, not many people even cared about Charles's last words. But she knows. Who is Yaya? When Emily returned home that night, she was bombarded with messages from Mia. Mia. What happened? Mia. He also knows your nickname? Mia. How dare he say that in front of so many people? If he doesn't like you, I will go to Tibet on foot. Faced with Mia's series of messages, Emily hesitated for a moment, typed a few words and sent them. Emily, I feel like I have someone I like. After a moment, Mia responded. Mia, Charles, right? Right. She likes Charles. She likes him very much. He is such a good man. She will like him in her next life too. On Sunday, the day off, Emily slept at home all day. When she woke up in the evening, it was dark. When I went downstairs, I didn't see my mother, so I guess she was working overtime again. Emily wanted to go out to buy some food, So she didn't change her clothes and went out wearing Packadog's pajamas and Packadog slippers that after eating spicy hot pot, they met an old man pushing a bicycle and selling candied haws on the street corner. Emily bought 2 strings and thought that the bookstore was close, so she ran to the bookstore to find Charles with the candied haws. When I pushed open the door of the bookstore, I saw Charles sitting at the counter with his legs crossed, playing games. Seeing that it was Emily, Charles quit the game with a flick of his finger. Looking at Emily in her pajamas, he paused and asked, "Why are you here?" Emily smiled and shook the candied haws in her hand. "I'll treat you to candied haws." As she spoke, she stuffed the candied haws into Charles's hand. Charles didn't like sweet things, so he was silent for a while, then took a small bite under Emily's expectant gaze. He smiled. "It's sweet." Emily was just about to ask him where the puppy was when she felt her nose getting hot and blood started flowing. She reached out and touched her hand, which was covered in blood. Charles panicked and quickly took out 2 pieces of paper to cover her nose and tilted her head back. "Don't bow your head." Emily stood there obediently and let him do what he wanted. Charles took her to the bathroom in the back room of the bookstore. Charles wet some toilet paper and wiped her nosebleed. Emily looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was messy and her lips were pale. She laughed. "Charles, am I going to die?" Charles raised his hand and knocked her head. "So many dramas when you get angry." Emily pursed her lips and let Charles continue to clean her nosebleed. After cleaning up, Charles was about to close the door. Emily wondered, "Why are you closing the door?" Charles raised his chin and motioned her to come out. After Emily left, he locked the door and said calmly, "I'll take you to see a doctor." Instead of taking her to a big hospital, Charles took her to a small clinic in an alley. When I entered the door, there were only a few children sitting on stools receiving 4 drips, with their parents sitting next to them. Emily froze for a moment, turned her head and asked, "What is this?" Charles took her to the inner room and said as he walked, "This doctor is very good at treating illnesses. I came here when I was sick when I was a child." The doctor was an old man who looked very experienced. Charles did not stay in the inner room any longer and left. Emily stayed in the inner room to see the doctor. After a while, Emily also came out. She pulled Charles to sit on the sofa and Charles asked, "Why, do you want an injection?" Emily nodded and explained, "It was just a case of getting angry, but he said my physical condition was too weak and asked me to take some amino acids." After the injection, Emily realized that there was a very young boy sitting next to her. Looking at her with his eyes rolling, Emily found it funny. She said softly, "Why are you looking at me?" The boy pointed at Charles standing beside him and said, "Sister, is he your boyfriend?" After the words fell, Emily and Charles were both stunned. Children speak without restraint. Children speak without restraint. Emily smiled and said, "No, she is my sister's good friend." The boy asked again, "Can I be your sister's boyfriend?" Emily was shocked by these words. She couldn't help laughing and reached out to touch the little boy's head. "Sister is much older than you." Then a lazy voice came from Emily's ear. "How old is the little brat, and he's already looking for a girlfriend?" The little boy pouted at Charles, looking at his stern face, and didn't dare to refute. Amino acids only require 1 vial of infusion, so it takes time. When Emily was leaving, the little boy had finished his 4 drip and there was no parent around. It was already dark outside. Emily hesitated and asked tentatively, "It's already dark, why hasn't your mother come to pick you up yet?" The little boy said seriously, "My mother is working in another place and my grandmother has difficulty walking, so I didn't let her come." Suddenly, Emily thought of her grandmother. When she was a child, her mother worked away from home and she was raised by her grandmother. She smiled and said, "Can I take you home?" The little boy nodded. Emily turned her head and saw Charles looking at her with a frown. She smiled awkwardly. "Why don't you go back first and I'll take him home?" Emily was wearing pajamas which were very thin. It was already night and the temperature outside was lower than during the day. Charles shook his head and said softly, "You just got the injection, go back first, I'll take him home." Emily was about to refuse, but as soon as she stepped out of the door, a gust of wind blew past, and she couldn't help shivering. In the end, Charles took the little boy home. On the way, the little boy took Charles's hand. He lowered his head and asked softly, "What's wrong?" The little boy raised his head and asked with clear eyes, "Brother, do you like that sister?" Charles' smile froze. "Why do you say that? When my sister was getting the injection just now, you were watching her the whole time." The cicadas kept chirping, the breeze swept through the woods, and the leaves made a rustling sound, which stirred waves in Charles's heart. Suddenly, the image of Emily loudly wishing him a happy birthday amid the sound of fireworks appeared in his mind. Sincere and warm, "Do you like it?" Charles chuckled. "I like it." It was almost half a month later that Charles discovered that there was a little pig on the originally clean draft book. You don't even have to think about who drew it. Elementary school student. Hearing this, Emily in the front row turned around slowly, looking confused. What's wrong? Charles leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on the draft book, and asked in a raised tone. Did you draw this? Emily followed his gaze and saw the piglet she had made. She immediately shook her head and said firmly, It wasn't me. Charles raised his eyebrows and looked at the little girl who was lying in front of him with a serious face, and found it a little funny. Charles. Charles turned his head and looked towards the back door. It was the boy who often played basketball with him. The boy waved and said, Let's go play basketball. Charles responded, stood up, threw a candy to Emily, and turned to walk towards the back door. He would give her a candy before every game. Emily looked at the candy lying in her palm and raised her head toward the back door. The sunlight shone onto the ground through the gaps between the leaves. Charles stepped on the light spots on the ground with an expressionless look on his fair and clean face. All kinds of noisy sounds in the teaching building mixed together and reached Emily's ears. Suddenly, she felt that everything around her was not as good as the boy in front of her. Emily turned her head to look at the draft book lying on Charles's desk. She had observed that half a month ago, the draft book had been pressed under various textbooks, and he seemed to have never turned the page. Suddenly, an idea popped into my mind. Emily bit her lip for a long time. Then she picked up the pen on Charles's desk, turned to the last page of the draft book, and wrote down carefully, I like you. Emily. At the back door of the classroom, Mia was standing at the door calling her. Emily panicked and scribbled the words she had just written, but she could still vaguely make out what she had written. Maybe, I also have some luck mentality, hoping that my love can be seen by him. There is still half a month before summer vacation after school. Mia asked Emily to discuss where to go during the holidays. Emily smiled indifferently. I can do anything. I'll listen to you. Mia. Then I have to ask James if he wants to join us. Mia has been mentioning James more and more frequently recently, and Emily vaguely smells something wrong. Emily turned her head and suddenly asked, Do you like James? Mia blushed and argued in panic. You like him. Emily smiled and didn't ask any further questions, nor did she expose the truth. When passing by Charles's bookstore, Mia stopped and said, I want to buy a book. Please come with me. Emily nodded and followed Mia into the bookstore. Charles was not in the bookstore. His father was sitting at the counter. His father looked up, obviously recognized Emily, and greeted her with a smile. Emily, you're not with Charles today? Emily was stunned. She seemed to have never mentioned her name in front of Charles's father, so how could he know it? But she still responded with a smile. No, uncle. Well, take whatever you want to buy. Emily nodded and Mia dragged her inside, asking as they walked, Have you met the parents? Emily was silent for 2 seconds, then said softly, I've met him a few times, but I never told his father my name. I don't know how he knew it. Mia said as she searched for the book she wanted. That's easy. He must have mentioned you to his father. Suddenly, Emily froze in place with no clear emotion in her eyes. When Mia was leaving after buying the book, she happened to meet Charles coming in. Charles greeted her calmly. Are you here to buy some books? Emily nodded. Charles threw something to her and she picked it up and saw that it was a bag of dried mangoes. Just as I was wondering. Charles's father at the counter suddenly said, Hey, you're giving your girlfriend your favorite food too? Mia also joked. Oh, you gave it all to your girlfriend? Emily's cheeks flushed. She thanked him and quickly dragged Mia out of the bookstore. When Emily returned home, as soon as her hand touched the door handle, she heard a quarrel in the house, followed by the sound of things being thrown. Emily's heart tightened, and after some hesitation, she opened the door and walked into the house. As soon as she entered the door, she saw Sophia sitting on the ground wiping her tears. Her father Zhengchang was still cursing at her. Emily hurried forward to help Sophia up. Seeing Emily coming home, perhaps he felt that having a punching bag was not enough, so he turned his target to Emily. 2 money losers. An old money loser gave birth to a little money loser. His words were harsh and hard to hear, and they struck directly at her heart. Emily felt her heart trembled. Sophia cried and said, You are so heartless, Zhang Chang. Over the years you have never taken care of anything in the family. I always paid back the loans. There are so many debts owed outside. Which one did I not pay back? Zhang Chang gritted his teeth, his face grim. Did I force you to pay it back? Who knows where your money came from? Emily frowned. Don't be so harsh. It's useless for a man to ask his wife to pay the debt. Perhaps it was because this touched a sore spot in Zheng Chang's heart. The veins on his forehead popped out. I'm your father, is it your turn to criticize me? Emily stared at him and said word by word. I say, you are useless. Bang! The next second, Zhang Chong picked up the small teacup at hand and threw it at Emily. It hit Emily's forehead squarely. Emily felt a piercing pain on her forehead. She raised her hand and wiped it, and her fingertips were covered in blood. Sophia's heart-wrenching roar came to my ears. Zhang Chong, do you want to kill Yaya? Emily suddenly felt very tired. She took out a few pieces of paper to cover the wound and said softly, I'm going to my friend's house. After saying that, he left home. While walking on the road, Emily took out her cell phone and sent WeChat messages to Mia. Emily, would you mind taking me in for a night? Mia, sure. Mia, but I'm at my grandma's house and won't be home until later. I'll pick you up when I get home. Emily. Okay. Emily searched her pockets. She only had $12 left from this month's pocket money after buying fireworks last time. It was definitely not enough to go to the hospital for a checkup. Mia isn't here now either. There was really no other way, so she came to the door of Charles's bookstore. After hesitating for a moment, she lowered her head and walked into the bookstore. Charles' father is not here. He must have gone home for dinner, but there was no sign of Charles, so she tentatively called out in a low voice, Charles. A familiar voice came from the back of the bookstore. Here we come. The next second, Charles came out. Why are you here? Emily stood there without saying anything, just looking at him. Only when I approached Charles did I see the clue. The pieces of paper she used to cover the wound were almost soaked. Charles' heart skipped a beat. He raised his hand and gently uncovered the paper Emily was covering her face with. What immediately came into his sight was the shocking wound. Charles threw away the paper and took out some new papers from the table to cover her wound. What's the matter? Looking at Charles's worried eyes, Emily suddenly felt very aggrieved. She pursed her lips and tears rolled out of her eyes. Charles was a little overwhelmed by her sudden tears and fumbled to wipe her tears. Emily sobbed and said, Why is it that out of so many people in this world my family has to be like this? Charles paused as he wiped her tears. Then, he gently took Emily into his arms and said softly, These are not things we can decide. If you don't want to stay in a broken family, you don't have to change, just escape. Emily cried for a long time. And finally Charles took her to the hospital to treat her wounds and her forehead was wrapped with gauze. After leaving the hospital, Charles asked, Have you eaten? Emily shook her head, so Charles took her to a noodle shop to eat noodles. While waiting for the noodles, Emily kept her head down and her eyes were red. Charles felt bad, so he stood up and said, I'm going to go buy something. Good. When Charles came back, Emily was full, with a large portion of noodles still left in her bowl. He asked, Aren't you going to eat anymore? Emily shook her head. I can't eat anymore. Emily sent the location to Mia, and Mia asked her to wait for her at the door of the noodle shop. After Charles knew about it, he nodded without saying anything. He waited at the door with Emily and handed the bag in his hand to Emily. Emily opened it, and saw that it was full of things needed to treat the wound, as well as some other unrelated medicines: stomach medicine, cold medicine, band-aids. Her nose felt sore. Why buy so many medicines? Charles' voice mixed with the noisy voices and reached her ears. I bought it for you as a spare. After a pause, he added, Of course, I hope you never have to use it. I don't know if it's because the wind is too strong at night or his words are too touching, but Emily's eyes are sore and she can't describe how she feels. Mia came very quickly and was a little surprised to see Charles there. She was even more surprised to see the bandaged wound on Emily's forehead. What happened, Emily? What happened to your forehead? Emily smiled nonchalantly and said calmly, I just bumped into it by accident. Mia looked at Charles behind her and asked again, Why are you with him? Before he could say anything, Charles said, Let's go home first. It's quite cold outside. Mia took back the words that were about to come out of her mouth and nodded. That night, Emily sent a WeChat message to Sophia at Emily. Mom, please give me a day off tomorrow. Mom. Okay. Mom. Are you at Mia's house? How is the wound on your forehead? Emily. Well, Mia helped me bandage it. Mom. That's good. The next day, Mia woke Emily up, and after she had packed up, Emily said, I asked my mom to take a leave so I won't go to school. Mia asked, Are you going home? Emily shook her head and said softly, I'm going to go find Grandma. Mia knew that Emily would go and sit at her grandmother's grave whenever she was in a bad mood. My grandmother's grave is not far away, just in the south of the city, just like Emily's mood. The weather today is not very good, and it is raining heavily outside the window. Emily used the last money she had to take a taxi. The rain was heavy, soaking her shoes and socks. Every time she visited her grandma in the past, she would bring a bouquet of flowers, but this time she didn't. Emily stood in front of her grandma's grave holding an umbrella, and tears fell unconsciously. "Grandma, I really miss you. Mingming, you are my only support. Why did you leave me? I'm not doing well. Why is it me?" Gradually, Emily's sobbing turned into squatting on the ground and crying loudly, and the umbrella was blown far away by the wind and in the heavy rain. She squatted there crying, her tears blurring her eyes and mixing with the rain. When she had cried enough and stood up, everything in front of her eyes went dark and she could not stand steadily, so she knelt straight on the ground. Blood seeped from her knees and mixed with the rain. Emily wanted to get up but she was too weak to stand. Then, warm liquid flowed out of her nose. Emily touched it and it was a glaring bright red. She propped herself up on the ground and tried hard to stand up, but her whole body was weak and she couldn't move. She knelt there, wiped the blood from her nose and suddenly laughed out loud. "What a rotten body. Forget it, it's better to die." The next second, an umbrella appeared above my head, blocking the wind and rain. Emily turned her head and saw Charles looking down at her with a pale face. She spoke in a hoarse voice. "Why are you here?" Charles did not answer her, but seized her wrist and began to pull her up. Emily's voice sounded a little aggrieved. "Charles, my legs are weak and I can't stand up." In the end, Charles carried her home on his back. She lay on his back and said, "I was soaked to the skin and you still carried me." Charles sneered. "Then stand up and show me." "Cut." In the silence, Emily suddenly asked, "What kind of girls do you like?" Charles replied, "You are like this." For a moment, Emily's heart was in her throat. Charles then said, "No. Are you ill?" Half a month later, the summer vacation of No. 1 middle school came quickly. On the afternoon of the holiday, after the exam, Emily was packing her school bag. Charles behind her suddenly stuffed the draft book into her school bag. She looked at him blankly. Charles said, "I'm too lazy to take the things back. I'm afraid the draft book will be lost. Please help me carry it." Oh. However, his reasons seemed to make sense, so Emily did not refuse. When he was about to leave, Charles suddenly grabbed him with a smile in his eyes. "If you have time in the evening, you can go to the bookstore to see the dog." Emily was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "Okay." That night, Emily quickly finished her meal, said hello to Sophia and went out. "Before I reached the bookstore, I saw Charles on the street with the big golden retriever sitting at his feet." Emily smiled, ran to Charles and patted him. "Charles?" Charles put away his phone. A smile appeared in his eyes. "Where do you want to go?" After thinking for a while, she said, "The beach." Charles handed the dog leash in his hand to her and walked side by side with her. There were people coming and going on the street, and with him around, I felt inexplicably at peace. When they reached the beach, Emily let go and let the golden retriever roll around happily on the beach. She and Charles were sitting on the side, the sea breeze blowing towards them, and she said, "You are such a good person. Who will get you the chance in the future?" Charles tilted his head slightly, with unfathomable emotions in his eyes, and his voice was a little hoarse. "If possible, I want to give it to someone I like in the future." Emily propped her chin up with both hands and glanced at him. "What kind do you like?" The golden retriever was amused by the waves at the beach. The two of them watched quietly. In the sea breeze, his voice floated into her ears. "I like those who are like elementary school students." Emily was startled and her heart skipped a beat. After a long while, she turned her head, smiled at him with sparkling eyes and said, "Then I wish you meet him." After saying that, she turned her head and continued to look at the sea. Charles' eyes stayed on her. He wanted to say that he had met her, but he couldn't open his mouth. When sending her home, Charles took out his mobile phone and said, "Add WeChat." Emily responded, pulling out her phone and scanning his QR code. After adding him as a friend, Emily waved to him and said, "I'm going home. Bye." Charles nodded. Emily turned and walked a few steps, and Charles suddenly called her, "Yeah." She paused and turned to look. Under the street lamp, he was enveloped by the light and smiled faintly. "See you tomorrow." Her heart warmed and she smiled. "Well, see you tomorrow, Xiang." Early in the morning before dawn, Sophia woke Emily up and told her to wash up quickly and go back home together. Emily was suddenly awakened. Her brain didn't react. "Why go back home? Your grandmother passed away." With a buzz, the last string in Emily's mind broke. Emily seldom sees her grandmother, except during the Chinese New Year. Every time they meet, her grandmother always forces red envelopes on her and leaves all the delicious food for her. Sitting in the back seat of the car, the window was fogged up. She raised her hand and wrote, "Grandma," and then scraped it off. She wrote again, "Grandma." Scrape it off again. Finally she wrote, Charles. Scrape it off again. Emily sighed and looked away with red eyes. At her grandmother's funeral, Emily saw many relatives she didn't know well. She knelt there and cried inconsolably. Then she turned and walked into the mourning hall. Grandma's portrait was facing the door, and Emily saw it as soon as she entered. The little old lady in the photo has a wrinkled face and a kind smile, as if she is looking at herself through the glass. Emily shed a tear and murmured, "I should have come back to see you more often. We meet so seldom, so you must come to me more often in my dreams in the future, little old lady. I will miss you." As she spoke, Emily herself began to sob. The funeral would last for 3 days, so they simply stayed in the village. It was not until the evening that Emily had time to check her phone and found that Charles had sent her a message. "See, why didn't you come to the bookstore today?" Emily paused her fingertips on the keyboard, typed a few words and sent them. "Emily, I'm at home, something's going on." Charles on the other side came back quickly to see. "Okay, you can come to me if you feel bad." Emily smiled softly, and could almost imagine the expression on his face when he said that. Over the next 2 days, Charles would come to chat with her and tell her bedtime stories when she couldn't sleep. On the 3rd day, when the funeral was held, Emily wore mourning clothes and watched her grandmother being buried numbly. She had been crying so much in the past few days that she was completely numb. She couldn't cry anymore. Grandma won't come back either. After it was over, she sent a message to Charles, but he didn't reply. She thought he was busy and didn't think much about it. By evening, Charles still hadn't returned. Sophia said she hadn't been back for a long time and wanted to stay a few more days. Emily understood and didn't resist, so she went along with her mother. She messaged Charles on the 1st day, but he didn't reply. I sent a message to Charles the next day, but he didn't reply. On the 3rd and 4th days, he did not come back, as if he had disappeared from the world. Emily was a little confused. She kept sending him messages but never got a reply from him. On the 5th day, Emily was playing with her dog in the village when she received a call from Mia. Emily smiled and answered the phone. "What's wrong, Mia?" Mia on the other end of the phone was silent for a while before speaking. "Emily, do you know about Charles's situation?" Emily was puzzled. "What's going on? He hasn't replied to my message in 5 days. Mia on the other end of the phone was silent again. Emily suddenly felt panicked and had a bad premonition. Sure enough, Mia on the other end of the phone spoke. "Charles died while saving a little boy in the river." With a buzzing sound, Emily's mind went blank. She was a little breathless. "How is that possible? He was still sending me WeChat messages 2 days ago. I know this is a little hard to accept, but it is true." The boy saw the sign prohibiting swimming and jumped in, and finally, Emily hung up the phone. Her heart felt so blocked, as if it was being run over by 100 trucks. Emily squatted on the ground with her hands covering her heart. She wanted to cry, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. Finally, Emily knelt on the ground in agony. Tears as big as beans fell to the ground, but she could not make a sound. She still didn't believe it. "I don't believe that the young man full of vigor and vitality would end his life at the age of 18." Emily asked Mia for James' phone number, and after hesitating for a long time, she finally dialed the number. It took a long time for James to answer the phone. His voice was weak. "Hello." Emily's heart was beating violently, and her throat choked for a moment before she spoke tentatively. "I'm Emily. Is Charles with you?" The moment he finished speaking, James on the other end of the phone fell silent. Emily's heart almost jumped into her throat. She was expecting James to tell her that Charles was having dinner with him as usual. But after a moment of silence, James' voice floated into her ears. "Mia didn't lie to you." Beep. Emily hung up the phone. Even so, she still wouldn't believe it unless she saw it with her own eyes. That night, Emily took a bus home early. When she rushed back to Lincheng, Charles's funeral had already ended. She dragged her legs to the bookstore. When I walked into the bookstore, Charles's father was sitting at the counter with a deathly pale face, and a mother and son were standing next to him. Seeing Emily walk into the bookstore, Charles's father spoke in a hoarse voice. "Emily." Emily nodded and called him uncle. The mother and son sensed something and hurriedly asked Emily, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Charles's?" Emily didn't respond, but just turned her head to look at Charles's father. She herself didn't know who she was to him. Charles' father raised his head, looked deeply at Emily, and said in a hoarse voice, "Girlfriend." The woman hurriedly held Emily's hand and said apologetically, Hello, I am really grateful to Mr. Charles for saving my son, but I am really sorry and I am really sorry. I am willing to compensate." Emily looked at her, then at the child beside her, and understood that. She slowly pulled her hand back and said in a cold voice, "Compensation? Then give him back to me. I want him to stand before me in person." Hearing this, the woman was obviously stunned, and then she reacted. "This person can't be resurrected, and I?" Emily interrupted her. Your son ruined other people's lives. It ruined Charles and ruined his life. He was such a good man. But his fate ended at the age of 18. Charles' father waved his hand and said in a calm tone, "Forget it, no need for compensation. Xiaoxiang is willing to save him, which means he knows the consequences of doing so. It is meaningless even if he asks for compensation." After sending the girl away, Charles's father comforted Emily. "It's okay, girl, look forward." Emily couldn't control herself anymore and tears started to fall. She didn't want to look forward. She wanted Charles back. Of course I can't bear to do that. Someone who is reluctant to carry candy with him to suppress the bitter taste of her medicine. Someone who is reluctant to call her an elementary school student every day. Someone who is reluctant to wish her good health with birthday wishes. That midsummer, she never saw him again in her life. In late autumn of the same year, Emily began to try to lead a normal life. And the first step was to clean her room. When cleaning the bookcase, she found a draft book at the innermost part of the bookcase. Emily recognized it at a glance. She put it away at the time because she was afraid he would lose it. When I opened the first page, I saw his eloquent handwriting. I say autumn is better than spring. In a trance, she saw again the boy standing in the corridor and calling her an elementary school student. She chuckled, remembering that she had written the words "I love you" on the last page. She smiled and turned to the last page. She turned to the last page of the draft book, and a note fell to the ground, followed by the second, the third, and the fourth. She bent down to pick up the note that fell on the ground, took a look at it, and her smile froze. "Elementary school student, I like you too. Do you think I won't read the last page of the draft book? As stupid as an elementary school student. Emily, don't forget me." Extra in the dead of winter that year, Emily was diagnosed with acute leukemia and was given less than 3 months to live. When Emily learned the test results, she didn't feel much of a stir. She just felt relieved. When she walked out of the hospital, it was snowing heavily outside. Snowflakes were floating on her body. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Remember to eat dumplings, Xiang." At the dinner table in the evening, Emily took out her medical records with a bright smile, without a trace of sadness. Mia and James beside him were silent. They looked at the medical record without saying a word. In the end, Mia couldn't help it and her eyes turned red. "Emily, don't be like this." Emily smiled and drank a glass of beer. "What's wrong? Why are you so depressed?" "It's not you who wants me to die, but me." Mia turned her head away and cried. James' voice was a little choked up. "Don't laugh so happily. Charles told me before he went down to rescue people that if he had an accident, he must protect you in number 1 middle school and not let you be bullied." Emily's smile faltered and she felt the beer get stuck in her throat. After a long while, she said with a trembling voice and a bitter smile, "He has promised this." James also shed tears and said nothing. Emily drank glass after glass of wine, which was bitter and unpalatable. Mia snatched her glass with tears in her eyes and raised her voice. "Don't drink it, look at how negative you are." Emily didn't argue, she just smiled. She said, "That mother and son want compensation. How can they compensate? Why don't they give me Charles? I will never see him again in this life. How can I compensate?" As she spoke, Emily's tears couldn't stop falling, and she kept talking. "That night, he told me he would see me tomorrow. He said he likes me too. How are we going to compensate for this? How do you think we should compensate for this?" The 3 people at the dinner table were all crying, but none of them had the words to comfort each other. Emily said in her heart, "There is no time in this life, so I will love you in the next life, and in the life after that." 2 months later, in early spring, Emily passed away. At the funeral, Sophia cried until she fainted. At that time, she had already divorced Emily's father. She lived a submissive life, hoping that her patience would allow her daughter to live a better life. In the end, it was her daughter's death that brought her the only bit of courage she had. Mia knelt there burning paper. Her tears had dried up, and her voice was light. "In my next life, I will choose a harmonious family and suffer less. In the next life, let's be with Charles." Under Emily's pillow was a draft book with 2 words carefully written on the cover. "Charles." She added it later when she was unhappy or couldn't sleep. She would take it out and look at it, as if the boy was still by her side. A sentence was added below the sentence. "I say autumn is better than spring. Autumn has always been a time of sadness and loneliness.